July 8th, 2026. The wind is coming off the dry floor of the Great Salt Lake and the ground is starting to move. It does not look like smoke. Out on the exposed bed, fine sediment lifts in sheets, turns southeast and comes down the Wasatch Front the way weather comes, as a wall. The sky over Salt Lake City goes orange, then brown, then something closer to dark. Visibility drops and stays down for more than an hour. Across the valley, particle monitors climb to roughly 4 times the level considered safe to breathe. 2.5 million people are standing underneath it. And here is the part that gets missed every time this story is told. The danger to Utah is not that the lake is disappearing. The danger is what the lake was covering. For 150 years, that basin had no outlet. Every stream running off the mining, the smelting, the industry, and the farms ended in the same water and stayed there, concentrating as the water evaporated around it. Roughly 800 square miles of that floor is uncovered now. Every soil measurement ever taken across it came back with arsenic above the level the federal government calls healthy. The water was never the resource being lost. The water was the lid. This is the story of the lake that is poisoning Utah. To understand what is happening to Utah, you have to go back to the shape of the ground itself, long before anyone built a city on it. The Great Salt Lake is what hydrologists call a terminal lake. Water flows into it, and water never flows out of it. There is no river leaving the far side, no outlet to the sea, no drain at the bottom. The only way water departs the Great Salt Lake is by rising off the surface as vapor, and when it goes alone. Everything the water carried in stays behind. That single fact explains why the lake is salty. It also explains something far less comfortable. For roughly a century and a half, the mountains ringing that basin were mined and smelted. Ore was crushed, metals were refined, tailings were left on hillsides, and industry discharged into streams that all ran to the same place. Farms sent their runoff down the same gradient, and every one of those streams terminated in a lake with no way out. So the dissolved load arrived, and the water evaporated off the top, and what was left concentrated. Then more arrived, then more evaporated. Over generations, the floor of the Great Salt Lake became a fine-grained mud holding arsenic, lead, lithium, thallium, cobalt, chromium, antimony, manganese, vanadium, zirconium, copper, and lanthanum. Some of it naturally occurring and concentrated by evaporation, some of it delivered by the industry that grew up around the basin. For most of that history, none of this mattered very much to the people living nearby. The metals were sitting under several feet of brine, and brine does not blow away. The water was the lid. Nobody thought of it as a lid. They thought of it as a lake. The Great Salt Lake sits at the bottom of a bowl left behind by an ancient inland sea called Lake Bonneville, at the eastern edge of the Great Basin Desert. What matters about that bowl is not how large it is. What matters is how flat. The modern lake is astonishingly shallow for its size, a thin sheet of water spread across an enormous, nearly level floor. That geometry is the entire problem. On a steep-sided lake, losing a few vertical feet of water pulls the shoreline back by a few yards. On a floor this flat, losing a few vertical feet pulls the shoreline back by miles, and every mile of retreat uncovers a band of exposed bed that used to be underwater. Since the late 1980s, the Great Salt Lake has lost roughly 2/3 of its surface area. What that left behind is on the order of 800 square miles of former lake bed, sitting open to the sky. More than half of the historic bed is now dry ground. Then there is the wind. The prevailing winds in that valley blow out of the northwest, which is to say they blow from the lake bed toward the mountains. And directly in that path lies the Wasatch Front, the narrow urban corridor holding Salt Lake City, Ogden, Provo, and their suburbs. Roughly 2.5 million people live there. That is about 80% of the population of Utah, arranged in a strip between the exposed bed and a wall of mountains. The mountains are the second half of the problem. Dust lifted off the playa is carried southeast into the corridor and then runs into the Wasatch Range, which stops it. The valley holds what blows into it. It is the same physics that gives Salt Lake City its winter inversions, applied to a different material. There is one thing standing between the sediment and the sky, and it is thinner than you would like. Much of the exposed playa is sealed by a natural salt crust that binds the mud underneath. Where the crust is intact, the surface is reasonably stable. Where it has been broken, by vehicles, by livestock, by waves, by the simple cracking of ground that dries out, the fine sediment beneath becomes available to the wind. Once that crust is broken, it does not reliably grow back. The lake is fed by 3 rivers, the Bear, the Weber, and the Jordan. All 3 are heavily diverted before they arrive. Agriculture is the single largest consumer of water in the basin, at roughly 65% of use, with cities, industry, and mineral extraction operations accounting for most of the rest. Underneath the arithmetic sits a legal framework that was built to move water out of rivers, not to leave it in a lake. For most of Utah's history, water left in a stream was water going to waste in the eyes of the law. The lake got whatever nobody upstream had already claimed, which over time was less and less. In October of 2021, the Great Salt Lake fell below its previous historic low. In November of 2022, it reached the lowest elevation ever recorded, 4,188.5 feet above sea level. In January of 2023, a team of more than 30 scientists and conservationists, led by Benjamin Abbott, a professor of ecosystem ecology at Brigham Young University, published an assessment with a title that left very little room for interpretation. They called it Emergency Measures Needed to Rescue Great Salt Lake from Ongoing Collapse. The arithmetic in that report was simple and brutal. The lake was losing an average of 1.2 million acre-feet of water every year, more than was coming in. Without an urgent and dramatic increase in flow, the report said, the lake as we know it was on track to disappear in 5 years. To stop it, regional water use would have to fall by at least 1/3, and possibly by half. Now, being honest about this matters, because that 5-year clock has very nearly run out and the lake is still there. Wet winters helped. The water came back up. As of the middle of August 2026, the Great Salt Lake stands at 4,190.4 feet, about 7.5 feet below its healthy range, and only inches above the 2021 low. It reached its highest point for this year on the 29th of April. It has been falling every day since. It is the 8th of July, 2026, and the wind is coming off the playa. Out on the exposed bed, in the places where the salt crust has already failed, the surface begins to move. Fine sediment lifts off the ground in sheets. It does not look like smoke. It looks like the ground itself deciding to leave. The plume builds and turns southeast, and it comes down the Wasatch Front the way weather comes. As a front, as a wall. From the valley floor, the color arrives before the dust does. The sky over the most densely populated ground in Utah goes orange, and then brown, and then something closer to dark. Visibility drops. It stays down for more than an hour. Drivers put their headlights on in the middle of a July afternoon. The mountains that ring the valley disappear behind it. The monitors are running the entire time. Across the Salt Lake Valley, particulate concentrations climb to roughly 4 times the level considered healthy to breathe. And then the mountains do what mountains do. The plume runs into the Wasatch Range, and the range holds it there, over the neighborhoods, over the schoolyards, over the gardens, until the wind that brought it decides to let it go. Nobody was evacuated. No sirens ran. There is no warning system for this, because a dust event is not a disaster in the way we have agreed to define disasters. It does not knock buildings down, and it does not produce a casualty count on the evening of the event. It arrives, it settles, and everybody breathes. Events like this happen around the Great Salt Lake somewhere between 3 and 8 times a year. Researchers who have gone back through the record have concluded they are considerably more frequent than anyone previously believed. The question that follows a day like the 8th of July is the obvious one. What did 2.5 million people just inhale? Arsenic is one of 13 substances that have been identified as potential concerns in the sediment around the lake. Testing of the exposed bed has found troubling concentrations of 9 heavy metals in particular: arsenic, cobalt, antimony, lithium, manganese, vanadium, zirconium, copper, and lanthanum. Arsenic and lithium levels in that sediment exceed the Environmental Protection Agency's standards for residential soil. Not industrial soil, residential, the standard applied to the dirt in somebody's yard. The particles themselves behave in ways that determine how much harm they do. The coarser fraction is caught largely in the upper airway, in the nose and throat. The finer fraction travels further down. Short-term exposure worsens asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and pushes people into emergency departments. Long-term exposure damages lung tissue and is associated with increased respiratory mortality. That is the part of this story that was expected. Dry lake, wind, dust, lungs. It is a chain anybody can follow. But it is not the whole chain, and the part that was missed turns out to matter more. To know what was in the lake bed, somebody had to go out and measure it. Not model it, not photograph it from a satellite. Measure it, on the ground, at enough points to mean something. Kevin Perry is a professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Utah. He got a bicycle. Over more than 125 days in the field, Perry rode roughly 2,300 miles across the exposed floor of the Great Salt Lake, towing an instrument behind him that measured how much wind energy it takes to break the surface crust and mobilize the dust underneath. He laid a grid over the playa with sampling points 500 meters apart. That worked out to 1 observation for every 92 acres of lake bed. At each of those points, he stopped. He recorded what he could see. He took 3 soil samples, 2 from the surface, 1 from beneath the crust, and he assessed how likely that particular patch of ground was to put dust in the air. He collected close to 16,000 soil samples. They weighed more than 4 tons. His team consolidated them into 122 batches, each one representing 16 square kilometers of dry lakebed, and ran them for 53 separate elements. Out of that work came a map of nearly 700 distinct dust hotspots ringing the lake, the specific places where the crust has failed and the ground is loaded and ready to fly. And out of it came one finding that is difficult to sit with. Every single measurement Perry took across the entire 800 square miles of exposed lakebed came back with arsenic concentrations above what the Environmental Protection Agency would consider healthy. Not most of them, not the hot spots, everyone. Annie Putman is a hydrologist with the United States Geological Survey. In the autumn of 2022, she and her colleagues deployed 17 passive dust samplers around the Great Salt Lake, instruments that simply sit and collect whatever the wind delivers. Then they modeled what that dust would mean for the people living in northern Utah, broken out by age. The study they published in the journal GeoHealth in 2025 reframed the question, because the lungs were not the only way in. Dust that lands on skin, on hands, on toys, on food, on the floor of a house does not stay outside the body. A meaningful share of it is swallowed. And when Putman's team ran the exposure numbers, ingestion turned out to be a major contributor to the total hazard, with thallium, arsenic, lead, cobalt, and chromium doing most of the damage in the estimate. The group carrying the highest exposure was children from birth to 6 years old. The reasons are physical, and they are the same reasons small children are the most exposed population in almost every environmental hazard we study. They breathe more air per kilogram of body weight than adults do. They play closer to the ground, where settled dust accumulates. And they put their hands in their mouths, which means they ingest a substantially higher dose of dust and dirt relative to the size of their bodies. Then, in the spring of 2026, a study led out of Utah State University extended the pathway one step further. Researchers found that metal-laden dust from the drying lakebed was moving into the food system, settling on crops and being taken up by plants and soils. Leafy vegetables exposed to Great Salt Lake dust carried elevated levels of elements, including arsenic and uranium. They carried those levels after being washed. Here is the part of this story that should unsettle anyone who thinks it is speculative. The United States has already done this once. We know exactly what happens because we watched it happen, and we are still paying for it. In 1913, the city of Los Angeles opened an aqueduct and began diverting the Owens River, roughly 200 miles north in eastern California. The water that had fed Owens Lake for millennia was sent south to grow a city. The lake, deprived of its river, began to go. By 1926, Owens Lake was a dry alkali flat. And then the wind found it. The exposed bed of Owens Lake became the single largest source of carcinogenic particulate air pollution in North America. When the storms came off it, dust surged across the valley in volumes that at times made Highway 395 impassable. The dry bed carried arsenic, cadmium, nickel, and other carcinogens, and it put them in the air over everyone living downwind. This went on for decades before anyone with authority did anything about it. In 1998, the Environmental Protection Agency finally ordered the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power to control the dust. By that point, the pollution coming off Owens Lake was reported at roughly 100 times the federal air safety standard. That is the record. A lake was drained to supply a city, the bed dried, the dust rose, and it took 85 years to compel a remedy. There was a town on the eastern shore of Owens Lake called Keeler. When Los Angeles took the river in 1913, it took the lake, and the lake had been the reason Keeler existed. What the town got instead was the bed. Today, roughly 21 people live in Keeler. The people who stayed developed their own vocabulary for what happens when the wind comes off the playa, because the standard vocabulary did not cover it. They call it Keeler fog. When it is bad enough that visibility falls to near zero, they call it a Keeler episode, and they describe breathing during one as hazardous work. The federal safety standard for particulate dust is violated at Keeler an average of 24 days per year. That is the worst record of any town in the Owens Valley. What that has done to the people there is documented. Surveys of residents affected by Owens Lake dust storms found the most commonly reported symptoms were aggravated sinus problems, increased allergies, headaches, and ear infections. Physicians in the region reported seeing more patients with emphysema, asthma, and chronic bronchitis when the dust was up. There is no dramatic moment in Keeler. Nothing collapsed and nothing burned. The town simply got smaller, decade by decade, while the ground it sat beside went into the air. Keeler is not a cautionary tale about the future. Keeler is the control group. It is what a community downwind of a drained terminal lake looks like a century in. So what does it cost to fix one? Beginning in 2000, under regulatory compulsion, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power started the largest dust mitigation project in the history of the United States. They flooded portions of the bed in shallow water. They laid gravel. They planted vegetation. They built a network of computer-controlled valves, pipes, outfalls, and sprinklers across an ancient lake bed to keep it from flying away. It worked. Dust emissions from the treated ground fell by 99.4%. The program has covered 48.6 square miles. It has taken a quarter of a century, and it has cost approximately $2.5 billion, paid by Los Angeles ratepayers. Now hold that figure against the ground in Utah. 48.6 square miles is roughly 6% of the 800 square miles of Great Salt Lake bed currently exposed. The most expensive dust remedy ever attempted in this country treated an area about 1/16 the size of the problem now sitting northwest of Salt Lake City. And after all of it, Keeler still fails the federal standard about 24 days a year. And the dust is only one of the things being lost. Between 10 and 12 million migratory birds across 338 species depend on the Great Salt Lake as a refueling stop. Birds that carry on to Siberia, to the Canadian Maritimes, to Central and South America. Up to 95% of every eared grebe in North America stops there. A single grebe needs something like 28,000 brine shrimp a day. As the lake shrinks, salinity rises. Rising salinity kills the algae. That starves the brine shrimp. And the South Arm shrimp population is expected to collapse at around 18 to 19% salinity. The birds do not have a second lake. Utah is not ignoring this, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. In May of 2023, the state appointed its first Great Salt Lake Commissioner. In the 2026 legislative session, lawmakers created the Great Salt Lake Preservation Program, which pays farmers fair market value to lease their water to the lake without permanently forfeiting the rights they hold, a genuinely important design choice because permanent forfeiture is the fear that has kept agriculture out of these deals for decades. Companion legislation streamlined the state engineer's ability to approve those leases, and the state bid in a bankruptcy proceeding and came away with 144,000 acre-feet of annual water rights and other assets from a mineral extraction company for $30 million. These are the most serious steps Utah has ever taken. They are also small against the arithmetic. The leasing program was funded at $2.75 million, set against an annual deficit measured at 1.2 million acre-feet. And there are things worth saying plainly on the other side of the ledger. The lake is not expected to set a new record low this year. Wet years genuinely help. Much of the playa is crusted and comparatively stable, which is why the hazard concentrates at the hot spots rather than spreading evenly across all 800 square miles. The dust that reaches the Wasatch Front is a mixture of lakebed and industrial sources, and the research is careful to distinguish between them. And Owens Lake is a comparison, not a forecast. The two basins differ in geology, in crust behavior, in wind, in who owns the ground, but none of those caveats change the shape of the thing. There is a lake in northern Utah that has lost 2/3 of itself, and beneath it is a floor loaded with arsenic that ran every measurement above the healthy threshold across 800 square miles. The wind blows from that floor toward 2.5 million people. It has already come down the valley this summer and turned the sky orange for over an hour. And America has already run this experiment once, at a fraction of the scale, and spent 25 years and $2.5 billion without finishing the job. The Great Salt Lake is not the thing that will hurt anybody. The lake is the lid. It is what the lake has been sitting on top of for 150 years that matters. And that ground is uncovered now, and it is upwind, and it is already blowing. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this one. These documentaries take a great deal of research and a great deal of time to put together, and the fact that you watched the whole thing genuinely means something. If you get anything out of it, a like, a comment, or a subscribe helps more than you would think. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.